So I've been demonstrating my 3D printed knitting machine using a DIY weighted hem, which consists of a knitted cast-on rag and an improvised weight from the hardware store. But you might have looked at this and thought, hey, if that cast-on rag was knit on this knitting machine, which it was, then how did I cast on for that in the first place? Isn't that a little bit of a chicken and egg situation? Well, all you really need to get cast on to the machine is a little bit of temporary scaffolding. You want something with two main features. You need loops to hang on the needles and some way to hold and distribute your weight. You could, of course, hand knit something if you already have the tools and the knowledge to do that. In my case, I actually messed around quite a bit with trying to come up with a fabric hem. I sewed a pocket into the bottom of this square of fabric, and that would hold the weight, and then I stitched some loops along the top edge. I was actually hoping that it would be sort of more of a permanent solution, but I ended up replacing it with the knitted cast-on rag because I was never entirely satisfied with either the construction method or the way this feels. And I realized that this definitely taps into a whole separate skill and tool set that maybe not everyone has access to if you don't have a sewing machine or you don't have a bunch of hand knitting supplies already lying around. How are you going to cast onto the machine? Well, I recently realized that there's a much more direct way using just the weight and some scrap yarn. So let me demonstrate that today. So my 12-inch bar is a pretty good length to span 3 of my standard gauge bed segments, or 75 needles. I'm going to start by pulling out every other needle, which would be 38 in total, but the bar is just slightly shorter than the actual full width of the beds, so I'm going to remove 2 of those needles at either edge to start out. We will add them back in after a couple of rows. So to start out, I need enough loops for 34 needles. Using waste yarn, I start with a slip knot and slide it onto the weight bar. Holding the bar in my right hand, I'm going to make loops with my left hand and add them to the bar, as if I were making a simple single cast on to a knitting needle. I'm making the loops loose enough that they can spread out, leaving a long bar in between each of them. Once I've created my 34 loops, I make sure all my needle latches are open and start hanging loops onto the hooks. I like to start from the outermost needles and work toward the center, which helps keep the weight balanced. I support the weight with one hand until I've finished hanging all the loops. Then I push the weight back towards the edge of the bed so the loops are behind the latches. Starting with the needle closest to the working yarn, I'm manually knitting stitches into the cast-on loops one needle at a time. I place the working yarn across the needle and into the hook. Then with my other hand, I push the butt of the needle back to pull a long loop through. I'm going to leave all these needles pushed back until the very end, otherwise the loose stitches might slip off while I'm completing the rest of the row. I'm trying to push every needle about the same distance back so the loops will be roughly even in length. When I've worked the whole row, I pull down on the weight, which brings all the needles and the new stitches forward to the working position. I load my yarn through the carriage and knit the next couple of rows by machine, checking after each carriage pass to make sure all the stitches knit correctly. I've got my tension on its loosest setting, which will make later steps much smoother. Now that I've established a couple of solid rows, I can start adding back the needles at the edges. Pretty much any increase technique should work here since I don't really need it to be pretty, so I'll demonstrate a few. For my first increased stitch, I'm going to pull out one new needle and move 2 existing stitches over, leaving an empty needle a couple of stitches away from the edge. I make sure to open the latch on this empty needle so it'll be able to catch yarn when the carriage passes. This will form a yarn over, which leaves a noticeable hole. And before knitting the row, I also clip a little bit of extra weight on the edge to help the new needle knit off correctly. Over on the other end, I'm going to do basically the same thing, but instead of leaving the needle empty this time, I'm lifting a bump from the row below. This prevents the hole. And again, I clip a little bit of extra weight below the new stitch just to help it along. Finally, I'm going to try this quick and kind of ugly increase right at the edge. Instead of transferring existing stitches, I'm just lifting a stitch from a previous row and popping it right onto the added needle. I probably wouldn't choose this increase for most projects, since it creates a really gnarly selvage, but that doesn't really matter here since it's just set up. It doesn't need to be pretty. However, the edge weight is super important for this one. Now that I'm finally working with the full width of my beds, I can put all the in-between needles back into work. Remember, all those out-of-work latches will be closed, so I have to flip them open before they can knit. Behold, I have waste yarn cast onto every needle, and I'm ready to knit a cast-on rag. I hope this quick little demo had some useful tips for you. Until next time, stay curious.